You can imagine federal revenues are falling through the floor. But Congress was not of a mind to reduce expenditures to meet the shortfall. So you had this yawning and increasing federal budget deficit. There was an increasing concern in Washington. So they decided in 1932 to try to fix the deficit problem. Well, you can attack a deficit a couple of different ways. One is you can reduce expenditures to meet the shortfall, or you can try to get more revenue. And so in 1932, opting for the second course, in the midst of a massive depression with unemployment way into double digits, what did they do? They passed the Revenue Act of 1932, which doubled the income tax. The top income tax rate even more than doubled. It was raised from 25% to 65%, more than doubling at the top rate. And it included many other tax hikes, excise taxes and what have you. One of the most gargantuan tax increases in American economic history, and it came in the midst of double-digit unemployment. So what that meant was if you happened to still be standing after Smoot-Hawley, if you were still making some money, now you really got it. Now you had to pay as much as 2/3 of what you earned at the highest levels to the federal government. 1932 was also an important elite year for other things, other reasons. It was a presidential election year. Can you imagine being Herbert Hoover and running for re-election in 1932? When you came into office, things looked pretty good. It was part of the roaring 20s, and now you've got this massive, nearly 20% unemployment. You've closed off trade, you've doubled taxes, and now you're going to ask the people to re-elect you? That was probably a lost cause from the beginning. But what made it worse for Hoover was the fact that he was up against a very charismatic, silver-tongued orator, the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When Roosevelt ran in 1932, this is unfortunately lost to history. So many of the history texts are written by, I think, by people who like to make the case for more government, so that they don't often point this out. But if I had been around in 1932 and believed, as I do now, in less government, not more, I would have voted for Franklin Roosevelt. Because he ran on a platform, this was part of the 1932 Democratic platform. He promised to reduce federal expenditures by 25%. That was a plank of the Democratic Party platform. Cut federal expenditures by 25%. He attacked Hoover, and here are FDR's own words, he attacked Hoover for presiding over the greatest spending administration in peacetime history. He attacked Hoover for raising taxes and massively increasing spending and all the other, so many of the other interventions that Hoover gave us during those years. Roosevelt's running mate was from Texas, John Nance Garner, and he made this accusation. He said Herbert Hoover was leading the country down the path to socialism. So, hey, if you believed in less government in 32, you would have voted for FDR. But it didn't take long after the election that he won in a landslide to discover he had no intention of doing any of that. And he gave us, in fact, quite the opposite. That brings me now to the third phase of the New Deal. The phase of, third phase of the Great Depression, the phase of the New Deal. Okay. And you all know the New Deal is the term to describe FDR's package of legislative initiatives. Many of them made their way through Congress in his first 100 days. He was a virtual economic dictator. Congress was eager to try something. Here was a guy who seemed to have the answers and certainly could give great speeches. He had the confidence and support of the country. He could have gotten through just about anything. There are two pieces of legislation that I want to zero in on in this third phase, because they were by far the most destructive and more impact on the economy than anything else. And by the way, this is a very interesting year from 33 to 34. So dramatic were the changes. I was reading something here recently, and a historian pointed this out to illustrate the dramatic shifts. He said, by 1934, you will have Roosevelt seizing private ownership of gold, seizing private gold under $10,000 fine or 10 years in prison. You had about a month and a half to turn in your gold. And at the same time, I think he decided that the country needed a good stiff drink, and so he pushed for the repeal of prohibition. And those two things happened within a few months apart. So if you think, in 1933, if you had two men walking down the street, one of them with a bottle of booze in his hand and the other one with a gold coin in his pocket. The one with the bottle of booze was the crook, and the one with the gold coin was an honest citizen. A year later, it was just the opposite. The guy with the gold coin, he's in violation of the law. The one with the booze having a good time after years of prohibition. So here we are. He takes office in March of 1933. And the first of these two pieces of legislation I want to zero in on is the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, which created a new bureaucracy called the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. The idea behind this law was that there was too much competition in the American economy. The problem was that prices kept plummeting, and every time some business was able to get prices up, somebody else would come along and undercut it, and that was hurting economic recovery. Okay, so we have to do something, FDR thought, to curtail competition. So this act was an attempt to organize American industry along the lines of cartels, with price controls, and to raise prices to get businesses all singing out of the same hymn book, to prevent them from undercutting each other through lower prices. This raised the cost of doing business on average by some 40%, which, again, in the midst of the Depression, when your profits have disappeared and your costs are out of line with your prices, you're not making money, the last thing you need is a law that forces your costs up even more. Remember, too, that one man's price is another man's cost. So when you force prices up over here thinking you're going to raise the income of those folks, you just cut the income of others by the same amount. This is redistribution through mandate, through force, in contravention of market forces. One man in particular, we often talk about when we discuss the NRA, because he is a great symbol for the oppression of this act. His name was Jack Megan. He was an immigrant and a tailor in New York City. He was prosecuted under the National Industrial Recovery Act and jailed for pressing a suit of clothes for the price of 35 cents when the NRA code price was 40 cents. Now think of it, we're in a depression. You're lucky if you've got a suit of clothes to press or the money to have them pressed. And here's a guy who said, I'll do it for 35 cents. He goes to jail because he didn't charge you 40 cents. And that is supposed to stimulate economic recovery. Of course, it didn't. It was horribly destructive across the economy. But if you think that was something, well, I should tell you too, you know who Roosevelt put in charge of the NRA? And they had their propaganda campaigns, they had their parades down Main Street, they had their Blue Eagle symbol that they encouraged businesses to put in their window indicating compliance with this new federal rule. He put in charge of it a man named Hugh Johnson, who was known as Iron Pants Johnson, because he was a no-nonsense, run it down and blow him up, kick him in the face kind of guy. A real bully. In fact, he was a professed admirer, publicly professed admirer of Benito Mussolini. Now, these are the years before Mussolini becomes quite the rogue in the world, but he was known in the mid-30s, early mid-30s, as a tough, strong man, making the trains run on time in Italy. And General Johnson here running the NRA wanted to imitate that. We'll give the orders and we'll make this economy recover. But if you think the NIRA was harmful, when do you hear of this other thing they passed, the AAA? The Agricultural Adjustment Act. Okay, again, one of the first 100 days New Deal legislation. Agriculture was in terrible shape. I love the names they give these things, by the way. National Industrial Recovery. How could you be opposed to that? They always name these, even the most destructive things, they give them high sound.